Hello and welcome to Global South Perspective. I'm Maureen Nkandu. And today we look back at the recently held United Nations General Assembly in New York, and specifically around the issues of UN reforms. So alongside that General Assembly meeting, a civil society organization, the African Youth Movement, held a panel discussion to discuss the issue of Africa's permanent representation or having a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So we would like to find out what exactly came out of that discussion, what would it lead to, what does all this entail. And joining us live from Lagos, Nigeria is Uwem Robert, and Uwem is a senior advisor of the Africa Youth Movement. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Okay, so as you're aware, the side event was on international governance and reform of the United Nations Security Council. And a lot of deliberations were held, and we came up with the fact that Africa needs to have a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. That was the first thing that was really discussed, and we had a consensus on that. And the agreement was that Africa as a continent is a large continent, is a new continent, and is a continent of the future. And Africa is beleaguered by a lot of conflicts and a lot of issues. And the conflicts alone, the wars, the ones we have in Sudan, in Libya, in Nigeria, in Chad, in Niger, all across this continent, including in Mozambique, all these crises necessitates that there should be a representative from Africa on the United Nations Security Council so that some of these challenges can be properly addressed. And so that was one of the first outcomes that came out of the side event that we had. And then again, there was an issue of marginalization of civil society groups. And we felt that it was necessary for the United Nations itself to open up the General Assembly to full and effective participation by civil society groups, and also allow civil society groups to have access to the United Nations offices in their home countries, and as well as government as well. So these are key issues that came up as a result of the side event.
Now, those are very important points raised there and good outcomes from that conference. But before we look at what difference Africa's permanent representation at the UN Security Council would make, or civil society engagement, what would entail Africa's representation? In what format would it be?
Ideally, it should be through the African Union. The African Union is the apex governance structure for Africa. And so just like you have the EU in the European countries and the other organizations that represent the other continents, I believe the AU has a key role to play in mainstreaming the participation of African countries at the Security Council. But what we thought was that there should be a rotational 2-year arrangement where countries are elected to sit on the permanent council, the Security Council, as permanent members for a 2-year period. That way, there will be a rotation and it will revolve around, and then it will be more effective. Remember, even within the AU itself, you have the SADC countries, you have the ECOWAS, you have all those arrangements that would also mainstream the participation of Africa on the Security Council of the United Nations. So I believe that the AU has a key role to play in mainstreaming membership of the Security Council.
Yes, good. So SADC, ECOWAS, those are referred to as regional economic communities that are representation of different countries within the regions on the continent in Africa. Now, there's obviously the argument of what difference would a permanent seat at the Security Council actually make for Africa. You've alluded to some of the conflicts that are happening, and some people say that most of the agenda of the UN Security Council is around civil war and conflict in Africa. But what difference really would permanent representation make?
Oh, it's going to make a whole lot of difference in terms of effective interventions in this crisis. For instance, you look at what's happening in Sudan today. it's very pathetic because there's been no clear, effective arrangement to either send peacekeeping forces or to impose sanctions on the warring parties. And I believe that if Africa had a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, that would be a voice. That issue would have been taken up and given priority. And so Africa having a seat at the Security Council of the United Nations is going to be a very big deal, because most of the crises and conflicts that are plaguing this continent would have timely intervention and will be clearly addressed. That's on the one part. On the second part, politically, that arrangement gives them some sort of status and relevance. And I don't know what structure it will be, but we're also advocating for a vetoing of that arrangement, where one country can veto an arrangement and collapse the arrangement. We want it to be owned by simple majority. If that's accepted, that would be good. So when you look at the political arrangement as it were today, the countries on the permanent representation of the Security Council have a lot of political relevance. So you see, for instance, the war in Ukraine, when it's taken up to the Security Council, Russia vetoes it. So politically, it's going to be a very big boost to Africa, and economically as well. Apart from the fact that the Security Council is basically about security, it also has those other addendums, the political aspects, the economic aspects. And so it's going to be a source of development and pride and value add to the continent of Africa if we can have representation on the Security Council. I believe that the permanent members of the Security Council have vetoes and they have a lot of influence. And that's what we are lobbying to get for Africa. And so when you look at those 5 countries, they wield a lot of political weight. So when they're sitting on the council, they can veto, they can lobby, they can do a lot of things and maximize the effect of their proposals and their whatever agenda they have for the Security Council.
The geopolitical dynamics and the interdependence in a certain way of Africa on these permanent members of the Security Council, even if Africa was seated at that Security Council, would we still have the muscle to go against some of these decisions?
They will be representing the interest of Africa as a permanent member of the Security Council, irrespective of any other encumbrances, alliances, and whatever would be. I would feel that the first priority should be the interest of Africa and the protection of the interest and advancement of the interest of Africa, irrespective of whatever those other influences are.
In the African Union itself, there are varied interests. The continent does not always agree on so many aspects. So already we are looking at a challenge.
I agree with you. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. That's why I think that the 2-year structure, the 2-year arrangement makes it such that any country representing the continent on the Security Council at that time should be made to understand, if you go against the interest of Africa, then the members of the African Union can decide to veto your participation on the Security Council at a later time. So these are some of the things that can be done at the regional level by the AU to ensure that any resolution that is put forward at the Security Council is a resolution that represents the interests of Africa. And if it doesn't represent the interests of Africa and an African country on the Security Council goes ahead to support, there should be ways of sanctioning. Let me give you a little example. Viktor Orban from Hungary is currently the EU chair, currently the chair of the European Union. And then Viktor Orban decided that, oh, I have an idea. I think I should go to Russia and negotiate for peace in Ukraine. And the entire EU said, no, that's not what we think. No, That's not what we want. And so when Viktor Orban came back from Russia and called for an EU meeting, a lot of those ambassadors, they didn't go. They didn't go. And they said, no, you're not representing our own intentions. And so that's the kind of structure Africa should have, so that once an African issue is on the table, we stick to it and ensure it gets through. And so if we have a Judas that goes to do something on the contrary, then that country has some sanctions.
Just one very quick question. You talked about one of the resolutions from the side event held on the margins of the UN General Assembly, which is about civil society involvement and engagement with the United Nations. I know that at a country level, there is that engagement between different United Nations agencies and civil society. So in what formation would you see this engagement? What more would you want to see?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. You know, participation of civil society during UNGA is restricted, is limited. For instance, during those debates, there are adverts, there are information that civil society participation is not allowed. So there are lots of restrictions that prevent the genuine voices of civil society being heard during the UNGA. I doubt if there are many civil society groups inside the General Assembly when the aides of government are giving their speeches. So that's what I'm trying to say.
But there are hundreds and hundreds of these civil society organizations, all representing different views. How then do we bring them together? Because the time at the UN General Assembly is limited, and as is the agenda, to speak as one voice. Who would be heard when there's a plethora of all these civil society organizations with different views and asks and calls to action?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. You know, the UN is a very organized institution. So you have the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. You have those organizations that are affiliated, that have participation with the UN at that level, and they know them. You also have the DGC affiliated organizations, that's the Department of Global Communications. And so these are avenues, organs through which organizations can be selected. Credible organizations can be selected on key issues, for instance, climate change, security, gender. So they can say, okay, we need 10 organizations to be a part of the UNGA during this debate. Okay, so we're going to roll out a competition for these organizations. Now, these are the issues that will be discussed. We ask you social questions, and then we'll pick out the best and then invite them to come over and participate during this debate. So it's not impossible. They have a way they can do it. They can do it. All we're saying is get us closer to the heads of government. Put us closer to them. Let us be next to them so that our value is shot up, so that they understand that the UN itself values us. That's what we're trying to say.
Well, we keep the hope. Uwem, thank you very much for sharing those insightful points. We appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Maureen. It's been my honor, and I look forward to more robust engagement with you. Thank you.
That was Uwem Robert, Senior Advisor of the Africa Youth Movement, a civil society organization that is really pushing the call for Africa's permanent representation on the United Nations Security Council. Join us again for another topic on Global South Perspective.